They came to Earth for assistance. Humans sent them back with upgrades and a fleet. The alarm did not wake me. I had not slept. I was already on my back under Engine Bay 7, a flashlight clenched between my teeth and a calibration wrench in my right hand when the ground shook. Not the kind of shake that makes you think earthquake. The kind that makes you think something enormous just sat down nearby without being invited. I pulled myself out from under the housing on a flat roller cart and lay still for a moment on the cold concrete floor, staring at the ceiling of the Nairobi ESA maintenance hangar. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, then held. Somewhere outside, I could hear people shouting. Not the panic kind of shouting, the confused kind, which is somehow worse, because confused people do unpredictable things. I stood up, pulled the flashlight out of my mouth, and walked to the hangar door. The ship sitting in the middle of Launch Pad 3 was not one of ours. I knew every vehicle on this facility. I had personally worked on most of them. I had the schematics for the rest memorized out of professional habit and mild obsession, which my ex-boyfriend once called endearing and later called the reason he was leaving. The thing parked on Pad 3 was not in any schematic I had ever seen. It was long and pale, like a splinter of bone carved into the shape of something that wanted to move fast. Its surface caught the floodlights and scattered them in directions that did not quite make sense geometrically. There were no visible engines, no exhaust ports, no landing struts that I could identify, and yet it had clearly landed because there it was sitting on our concrete without having broken through it. My name is Yara Okonkwo. I am an aerospace engineer, specializing in propulsion systems. I have worked at the ESA Nairobi facility for 11 years. I have a wrench in my hand and grease on my forearm, and I'm the first human being on this planet to realize, with absolute calm certainty, that what I'm looking at belongs to someone who does not live here. I walked toward it. Colleagues later called this brave. My supervisor, Colin Adler, used the word reckless. He said this while gripping a coffee mug with both hands and speaking in the slightly too controlled voice of a man who is working very hard not to shout. I did not think of it as either brave or reckless at the time. I thought of it the way I think about every broken or unfamiliar piece of machinery. If I do not go look at it, I will not know what is wrong with it. And if I do not know what is wrong with it, I cannot fix it. The ship had opened by the time I reached the edge of the pad, not with a hatch or a ramp. More the way a hand opens, slowly and deliberately, sections of the hull folding back in a way that suggested the material itself was either very flexible or not entirely solid. Out of that opening came 3 figures, and they were nothing like anything I had been told to expect, partly because no one had ever genuinely told me what to expect from something like this, and partly because even my imagination, which is quite good, had apparently been thinking too small. They were tall. Not dramatically tall, maybe 2.5 meters at most, but the way they held themselves made them look taller, the way a well-balanced structure always looks larger than its measurements. They had 6 limbs, the lower 2 functioning as legs, the upper 4 arranged in pairs that could serve as arms depending on what was needed. Their skin, if it was skin, was a pale silver gray that shifted at intervals into soft patterns of blue and amber light that moved across their bodies like slow waves. I would learn later that this was how they spoke to each other. I stood there watching those patterns ripple and did not know that yet. At that moment, I was cataloging them the way I catalog unfamiliar components. Shape, material, behavior, function, what might be broken. The one in front stopped a few meters away from me. Its eyes, 4 of them arranged in a gentle curve across the upper part of its face, looked at me with an expression I could not read. Then the light on its skin shifted into a different pattern, and a voice came from somewhere on its body that was not its mouth, which did not move. "We are looking," it said, in English that was accented in a way I could not place, "for whoever is responsible for building things here." I looked down at the wrench in my hand. I looked back up. "That would be me," I said, more or less. There was a pause. The light patterns on its skin cycled through something complex and rapid, and the other 2 figures behind it responded with their own brief flickers. I got the impression this was the equivalent of a very quick side conversation. "You are a construction specialist." "Propulsion engineer," I said. "Aerospace. I maintain and develop the engines on spacecraft." Another pause. More light. "That is, the figure said, and something in its translated voice sounded like it was choosing the next word carefully. Exactly what we need. Its name, it told me, was Xale. The translation device it used converted this into something close to that sound, though I was told later that the original was a pattern of bioluminescence that had no phonetic equivalent. Xale was what I would call a senior officer, though the Vale social structure did not map cleanly onto military ranks or onto any human organizational system that I was familiar with. The Vale had been traveling for what translated as roughly 4 months of their time, searching for a civilization capable of helping them. We were the third planet they had visited. The first two had turned them away. They walked me onto the ship. I want to be clear that no one authorized this. My supervisor, Colin, found out about it approximately 40 minutes later when he arrived for the morning shift and was told by a very pale security officer that Dr. Okonkwo had boarded an extraterrestrial vessel and had not come back out. He later told me that he sat down on the floor of the security office, which is not something he would typically do, and stared at the wall for about 90 seconds before he remembered that he was supposed to be in charge of things. Inside, the ship was quieter than I expected. The air was slightly warmer than comfortable and had a faint smell I could not categorize, something between salt water and the inside of an old library. The corridors were lit by the same soft, bioluminescent glow that came from the Vale themselves, supplemented by strips of light along the floor that pulsed slowly in one direction, which I gathered was a navigation aid. Everything was smooth and curved and pale. There were no sharp edges anywhere, no exposed joints, no visible fasteners. It was the most elegant construction I had ever walked through, and within about 3 minutes, I had already identified 4 things that worried me. Xale brought me to a chamber deep in the ship that I would later understand was the engine room, though it looked nothing like any engine room I had ever been in. In the center of the room hung a structure roughly 3 meters across that appeared to be made of intersecting crystalline lattices, each one glowing faintly, rotating at intervals in different directions. It was beautiful. It was also making a sound at the edge of my hearing that I did not like at all, a fine, tight stress sound like a glass being rubbed too hard. "This is your primary drive?" I asked. "Yes," said Xale. I walked around it slowly, looking at it from different angles. A Vale technician standing near the wall watched me with what I had begun to recognize as the posture of controlled anxiety. 3 of the 4 upper limbs held close to the body, the light patterns dimmed and slow. "Can I touch it?" A pause. Xale and the technician exchanged a rapid light conversation. "Yes," Xale said. Carefully, I put my hand near the surface of the nearest lattice arm without quite touching it and felt the vibration in my palm from 6 inches away. Then I touched it one fingertip lightly. It was warm. The stress sound grew slightly when I made contact and faded when I pulled back. I stepped away and looked at Xale. "Walk me through what has been happening," I said. "Start from the beginning, and do not leave anything out because you think it does not matter." Xale told me. The Vale were one of 11 species in a loosely organized interstellar group called the Concordance, which was not a government or a military alliance, but something closer to a neighborhood of civilizations that had agreed, over centuries, to leave each other alone and occasionally trade. The Auric were not part of the Concordance. The Auric were a considerably larger civilization that had spent the last 3 of what Xale described as long cycles, which I estimated at somewhere between 20 and 30 Earth years, systematically dismantling Concordance territories. They did not conquer in the traditional sense. They arrived with a technology that disrupted the crystalline lattice drives that most Concordant species used for travel and propulsion, and they disabled fleets, took resources, and withdrew, leaving behind civilizations too weakened to resist the next visit. The Vale had lost 4 of their 8 inhabited systems in the last cycle. They had lost their fleet's capacity to respond effectively. Their engineers were brilliant, Xale said, and I believed it because what I was looking at was extraordinary. But brilliant had not been enough. "Why come to us?" I asked. "We are not part of your concordance. You do not know what we are capable of." Xale's light patterns shifted into something long and slow that the translation device rendered as a moment of silence before words. "There is," it said, a kind of information that travels through the civilizations that observe younger worlds. Not formal communication, more like reputation. What is observed of your species from a distance over time is an unusual pattern. Another pause. You are not the most advanced civilization we could have approached. You are not the most powerful. But the report on your species consistently noted one particular quality. What quality? I said that when something does not work, Xale said, you do not stop. You change your approach. You try something else. You keep trying something else until it works, or until you find a different problem to try something else on. This was described in the observation records as, and here the translation produced a phrase that I think in the original veil was something closer to a visual concept rendered in light, inelegant persistence. I looked down at the wrench still in my hand. That sounds about right, I said. Outside, I could hear the growing sound of vehicles and voices as the facility's response team finally organized itself into something approaching order. Someone with authority would be arriving soon to tell me I was not authorized to be on this ship. Someone with more authority would be arriving after that to tell me I absolutely was not authorized to have agreed to anything. There would be meetings. There would be committees. There would be a process. I did not have time for any of that because I had just put my hand on a crystalline lattice drive and felt exactly what was wrong with it. And the feeling I had was the specific, particular feeling that I get when I understand a broken machine well enough to begin thinking about how to fix it. I'm going to need access to your engineering schematics, I said to Xale. And I'm going to need a workspace. And coffee. A lot of coffee. I paused. You do not have coffee. We do not. Xale agreed. Then someone is going to need to bring me some from outside. I turned toward the chamber door. And tell whoever is getting ready to come in here with security to calm down. No one is being invaded. We're going to have a conversation. I glanced back at Xale. It is going to take about 4 hours, and at the end of it, your people are going to make a decision about whether you want our help. For what it is worth, I'm already going to say yes on my end. You are authorized to make that decision. I thought about Colin Adler sitting on the floor of the security office. Not even slightly, I said. But somebody has to start. Xale's light patterns did something I had not seen before, a rapid warm flicker across the chest that faded quickly, like a small fire, catching and settling. I would learn later that in Veil body language, this was the equivalent of a short, involuntary laugh. At that moment, I just filed it away with everything else I was cataloging and walked out to start the most important argument of my career. The schematic for the Veil primary drive took me 6 hours to read. Not because it was poorly organized or because the translation was bad, though translating engineering documents between species turned out to be its own very particular kind of work. It took 6 hours because it was one of the most sophisticated pieces of engineering I had ever encountered, and I am not someone who says that easily. I grew up with my father's engineering textbooks stacked in the hallway of our apartment in Lagos. And I've spent my entire professional life surrounded by machines that push the limits of what materials and physics will permit. The Veil drive schematic made most of what I knew look like a rough draft. That was exactly the problem. I was in the cargo bay that Xale had cleared for me on the second day. The Veil had brought the ship to a different area of the facility at the request of the ESA director, a careful man named Arthur Finley, who wore the expression of someone who had prepared for many professional emergencies and was calmly adjusting to the fact that none of them had been this. Arthur had spent the first day negotiating permissions with 11 different government bodies simultaneously. On the second morning, he knocked on the cargo bay door, came in, looked at the 6 whiteboards I had filled with diagrams and notes, and said, very quietly, "Yara, are you all right?" "I am excellent," I said, without looking up from the schematic on the portable display I had brought from my own office. "I have not slept, but I have had a great deal of coffee, and I think I understand what is wrong." Arthur looked at the whiteboards again. "Should I be worried?" "About me, no. About the situation, moderately. But I think we can manage it." I finally looked up. "How are the political conversations going?" "Exactly as you would expect," Arthur said, which meant slowly and with enormous amounts of paperwork. But the general direction is yes. Provided we're not committing to anything military. "We are not committing to anything military," I said. "We are committing to engineering assistance." "There is a difference. You're going to have to explain that difference to several heads of state. Then give me a video call, I said. 1 hour. I will explain it and answer questions, and then I need to get back to work. Arthur nodded, which was one of the things I genuinely liked about him. He did not argue about things that were not worth arguing about. He went to arrange the call, and I went back to the schematic. Here is what I had found. The Veil crystalline lattice drives were built on a principle so theoretically pure that they had optimized themselves right past the point of practicality. Imagine a bridge built by someone who understood the mathematics of load distribution so perfectly that they calculated the minimum amount of material needed to bear the maximum expected load, and then build exactly that bridge with no additional material, no redundancy, no margin for anything unexpected. That bridge would work perfectly under every condition it was designed for. Under any condition it was not designed for, it would not fail gradually or gracefully. It would fail completely. The auric resonance disruptor, as best as I could understand it from XALS description, worked by introducing vibrations at the specific frequencies that crystalline lattice structures could not absorb. Not because the drives were weak, because they were too efficient to have anywhere to put the extra energy. A drive with redundancy and imperfection in it would simply absorb the hit across multiple pathways and keep functioning. A drive refined to mathematical perfection had no such pathways. The energy had nowhere to go except into the structure itself, and the structure came apart. The Veil engineers knew this. They had been trying to solve it for 3 years with increasingly sophisticated responses, refining the lattice further, adding precision shielding, developing counter-resonance algorithms. All of it elegant, none of it working, because they were trying to solve a problem of over-refinement with more refinement. I had a different idea. It was not elegant. It was also not original in any profound sense. Versions of the principle had been used in everything from building foundations in earthquake zones to the suspension systems of vehicles on rough terrain. The idea was simple, controlled imperfection. If I could introduce deliberate structural variation into the lattice, irregular load pathways, small intentional inconsistencies that redirected stress rather than absorbing it, the drive would have somewhere to put the energy from the resonance weapon without collapsing. It would be messy, eh? It would be slightly less efficient under normal operating conditions. It would be noisier in every sense, but it would survive. I explained this to Xale that evening. I had the diagrams on a shared display between us, sitting at a low table the Veil had brought from the ship, because their body geometry did not suit human chairs. The Veil lead engineer, a figure called Veth who communicated primarily through rapid and extremely expressive light patterns that the translation device sometimes struggled to keep up with, was present as well. When I finished, Veth's light went very still. XALS patterns cycled through something slow and complicated. "You are proposing," Xale said finally, "to make the drive less perfect." "I am proposing to make it survivable," I said. "Those are not the same thing, but right now survivable is more useful than perfect." Veth's lights did something abrupt and dim. This is the translation produced after a half-second delay, a difficult concept. "I know," I said, "but consider this." I pulled up a new diagram, something I had drawn from memory, the cross-section of a willow tree compared to an oak in a storm. The oak was stronger, denser, more rigid. The willow bent. Which one is still standing after the wind? I said. Veth's lights stayed dim for a long moment. Then a single warm pulse moved from the center of its body outward, and the translation device said nothing, but Xale told me later that the light meant something close to reluctant understanding. "Show us," Xale said. They gave me access to a test unit drive, one of several on the ship that had already been partially damaged and pulled from service. I spent 3 days dismantling it, studying it at the component level, and then began carefully, methodically introducing the variations I had designed. I was working with materials and assembly methods that I had never used before in my life, guided by Veil technicians who were trying very hard to trust a process that violated every principle of their engineering tradition. It was painstaking and often frustrating. There were moments when I had to stop and simply describe, as clearly as I could, why the irregular shape I was creating was not a mistake. On the 4th morning, 2 things happened. The first was the arrival of a transport carrying 6 people who stepped off looking like they had been traveling for a long time and were ready to work. Two propulsion specialists from the ESA Cologne facility, whose names were Dan Marsh and Claire Osei, a materials scientist named Priya Sutton for the Cambridge Research Division, a naval architect named Noel Barron who specialized in structural design under load, and two people who were introduced to me as a Formula One pit crew from the Haas team, which upon reflection made complete sense, because there is no more useful specialist in a high-pressure, time-critical material and mechanics environment than someone who can rebuild a racing car in 90 seconds while other things are happening around them. Their names were Pete Hale and Lou Crane, and within 4 hours they had identified 3 cargo bay organization improvements that none of the rest of us had noticed. The second thing that happened was that the modified test drive came online. It sounded wrong. That was the first thing everyone in the room noticed, including me. The Vale standard drive has a sound that is almost inaudible under normal conditions, a precision hum at the exact edge of hearing. The modified drive had a low, irregular knock to it, a rhythmic but slightly uneven beat that moved through the floor of the cargo bay when I powered it up. Veth's lights flickered in what I had come to recognize as distress. That sound, Veth said, indicates a malfunction. No, I said, it indicates imperfection. There is a difference. I pulled up the resonance test we had prepared, a scaled simulation of the auric disruptor frequency, running at reduced power through a containment field the Vale engineers had helped me build. Watch the structural integrity readout. I ran the test. The modified drive absorbed the resonance load and kept running. The readout showed stress distribution spreading across multiple pathways, none of them carrying enough load to cause failure, all of them functioning. The knock in the sound changed slightly as the load moved through the structure, but the drive did not stop. When I cut the test frequency, it returned to its previous state without any intervention. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Dan Marsh, who had been watching over my shoulder with his arms crossed, said, "You know what that reminds me of? The way we solve knock in a diesel engine. You adjust the timing until the combustion cycle is just irregular enough not to create harmonic buildup." "Yes," I said. "That is exactly what it reminds me of, too." Veth's lights were doing something I had never seen before, a rapid, expanding wave pattern that Ksale told me later was the Vale equivalent of the moment when a person sees something so unexpected and so obviously correct that their body responds before their mind catches up. Priya leaned in to look at the structural readout more closely. "Can you do this to every drive in the fleet?" "Not every drive," I said. "Not quickly. But we can do the most critical vessels first, and we can train the Vale technicians to continue the work while we move on to the next problem." I looked at Ksale. "What else is on the list?" Ksale produced a list. It was longer than I had expected. "All right," I said. I looked at the team around me, at Dan and Claire and Priya and Noel and Pete and Lou, all of them already leaning in toward the display, already thinking. Let us get to work. We worked. Days passed in a rhythm that had nothing to do with regular schedules or reasonable hours. Pete and Lou organized the cargo bay into something that functioned like a genuine workshop, with a logic and efficiency that made the available space feel twice as large. Noel started on the hull architecture of the Vale ships, identifying the structural load points that would need reinforcement once the drives were modified, because changing how a drive handles stress changes how that stress is transmitted to the hull, and if you fix one without the other, you have solved half a problem. Claire began working with the Vale technicians directly, developing a training protocol so that the modifications could be implemented consistently even without a human engineer present. Dan disappeared into the drive schematics for 36 hours and emerged with a proposed refinement to my frequency deflection design that was measurably better than the original, which I told him directly, because telling people when they have improved your work is important. Priya made the discovery that changed the shape of the project. She had been studying the Vale drive materials at the molecular level using a portable spectral analyzer she had brought from Cambridge, and she came to find me on the evening of the 7th day with an expression I recognized as the expression of someone who has found something unexpected and is not yet sure if it is a problem or an opportunity. "The lattice material," she said. "Do you know what it is most similar to at the structural level?" "Tell me." "Carbon nanotube composite," she said. "Not identical. Much more sophisticated in how the matrix is organized, but the fundamental stress response behavior is in the same family. She pulled up a side-by-side comparison on her tablet, which means that some of the reinforcement chemistry we developed for nanotube composite applications on Earth might translate. With modifications, I looked at the comparison for a long time. How confident are you? 60%, she said, which is why I'm telling you now instead of waiting until I'm more certain. Because if this works, it changes what we can offer them. What does it change? Right now, we are patching what they have, Priya said. If this works, we can help them build something better. Not just modify their existing materials. Develop a new composite lattice that has the veil drive efficiency and our stress distribution properties built in from the beginning. She paused. It would take longer, but the result would not be a drive that survives the resonance weapon. It would be a drive that does not care about the resonance weapon. I was quiet for a moment. Outside the cargo bay, through the walls of the ship, I could hear the faint sound of the facility at night, the hum of equipment, the distant movement of vehicles. Very ordinary sounds that felt, in that moment, quite far away. Start working on it, I said. Tell me what you need. On the morning of the 12th day, a Veil Scout vessel returned to the facility in a state that the pilot described, via the translation system, as having survived a situation it should not have survived. It had been on a supply run along a known Veil route when an Auric patrol intercepted it. This was a small vessel, not a combat ship, and the crew of 4 had fully expected the outcome that every previous encounter like this had produced. Instead, the modified drive had absorbed the resonance hit. The ship had held together, and the pilot had been able to execute an escape at full drive power. The crew was unharmed. The ship was functional. The pilot, whose name translated to something the device rendered as Sail 6, stood in the cargo bay and produced a light pattern that went on for quite some time. Sail translated it for me afterward. Most of it was too specifically veiled to convey clearly in English, but the core of it was, we did not die, and we thought we were going to die, and then we did not. Sail 6 also noted, with what I gathered was both honesty and slight bewilderment, that the modified drive made a sound they had never heard a drive make before. I know, I said. It is called knocking. I can adjust the timing, and it will be less noticeable. Sail 6 lights asked, through Sail, does the sound mean something is wrong? No, I said. It means something is working differently than you're used to. There is a difference. I picked up my wrench. Give me 20 minutes. I fixed the timing. The knocks softened to an irregular but gentle rhythm that Veth, listening nearby, said reminded them of certain natural processes they associated with healthy systems. I told Veth that was essentially what it was. Veth's lights did the expanding wave thing again. That evening, I sat on the edge of a supply crate in the cargo bay after everyone else had gone to sleep or to their quarters or wherever each species went when they needed to rest, and I looked at the modified drive housing on the test unit and thought about what Priya had said. We had come here to help fix a ship. What we were actually doing was something larger than that, and it kept getting larger the more we understood it. I got out my notebook. I have always kept paper notebooks. I know this is old-fashioned. I do not care, because paper does not lose power and does not freeze and does not require a network connection. And at 2 in the morning on an alien spacecraft, when you want to write something down, those properties matter. I opened to a fresh page and started writing down every problem I had not solved yet, which is always the most useful list to make. It was a long list. I was looking forward to working through it. Sail found me there about an hour later, still writing. It had a way of moving very quietly that I had adjusted to by now. It settled into the posture the veil used for sitting, which looked uncomfortable by human standards, but apparently was not, and its lights moved in the slow pattern that I had come to associate with the state it was in when it wanted to say something and was thinking about how to say it. Can I ask you something? It said. Yes, I said. Why are you still awake? I am working, I said. You have been working for 17 hours. I know. I work better when I am tired. My brain stops arguing with itself and just solves things. The lights moved in a pattern I had seen a few times before, quick and warm. The small fire catching. The other humans, Xale said. Do they also work this way? Most of the good ones, I said. Xale was quiet for a moment. We came to your world because a record said you did not give up on problems. I did not entirely believe the record. I believed it enough to try. Its lights shifted to something slower and more deliberate. I believe it now. Good, I said. Because we're not close to dawn. I know, Xale said. I find that I'm no longer concerned about that. I went back to my list. Xale stayed, its lights dim and steady, not speaking, not needing to. Outside, the facility hummed. Inside, the modified drive breathed its irregular, functional, inelegant, living beat into the floor, and I kept writing. Nobody sent us a formal invitation. That was the thing I kept thinking about as I looked at the approach display and counted the ships coming toward us. 3 of them, which my new colleague Veth identified as Thuan vessels before the recognition software could even process the silhouette. The Thuan moved differently than the Veil. Their ships were wider and lower, and they arrived in a formation so close together it made every person in the Velshorth navigation room hold their breath. Because if any one of those ships made a fractional course adjustment in the wrong direction, they would clip each other, and a Thuan hull collision at approach speed was the kind of event that did not leave much to analyze afterward. They did not clip each other. They stopped so precisely that the gaps between them could have been measured with a tape rule, and they held there, unmoving, waiting. They heard, Xale said from beside me. About the scout ship? I said, about the scout ship. About the modifications. About you. Its lights moved through something unhurried. Word travels in the concordance, especially when the word is unexpected. That was 12 days after Sail 6 return. In those 12 days, we had modified the drives on 8 Veil vessels, trained 11 Veil technicians in the base procedure, completed the first prototype of Priya's composite lattice material in a quantity small enough to coat a single structural test panel, but with results that made her sit very quietly for a full minute before she said anything, and found 3 additional structural problems in the Veil fleet that no one had previously identified because they were subtle and were only visible once you knew what the stress redistribution from the modified drives was going to do to the hull load points. Noel had found all 3 of them. He had the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had spent his career catching things other people missed, and aboard the Velshorth he seemed, if anything, more alert than usual, as if the unfamiliar environment had sharpened his attention rather than disrupting it. The Thuan communication came through on a channel the Veil, opened at a concordant standard frequency. The translation was rougher than the Veil one, the syntax of Thuan language apparently being considerably different in structure from anything the translation network had been optimized for. The message, as best as I understood it, was something close to, "We know you are doing something to the drives. We need the same thing. We are here." Xale looked at me. "Your decision," it said. This had become the operating understanding between us over the 2 weeks. Xale was the ranking Veil officer, and I was the ranking human engineer, and in the area that mattered most right now, which was the area of knowing what to do with broken machines, I made the calls. I looked at the 3 Thuan ships on the display. "Bring them in," I said. The Thuan were not like the Veil. The Veil were precise and quiet, and communicated in light, and moved with a deliberate economy that made every gesture look considered. The Thuan were a hive collective species, which meant that each individual was a node of a larger shared consciousness, and they did not have individual names in the way I understood the concept. They referred to themselves in a way that translated as functional identifiers: the one who navigates, the one who monitors structure, the one who manages propulsion. I worked primarily with the one they designated as propulsion primary, and I will tell you that working with a being that is part of a collective consciousness is a very particular experience, because there are moments when you're asking a question and you can see the answer arrive not from memory or calculation, but from somewhere outside the individual in front of you, as if the rest of the collective simply placed the information in them while you were watching. Their ships were, in their own way, as impressive as the Veil vessels. But where the Veil were refined, the Thuan were forceful. Their drive systems were large and powerful and delivered enormous thrust with a consistency that the Veil drives could not match in raw output. They were also, as I discovered when propulsion primary walked me through the navigation logs, catastrophically inaccurate. Their ships hit hard and fast and went generally in the right direction. The margin of error on a standard Thuan approach maneuver was wide enough to make Noel wince when I showed him the numbers. How have they not destroyed each other on a regular basis? Noel said, looking at the approach telemetry from their arrival outside the ship. Their formation flying is extraordinary, I said. They compensate collectively. Each ship adjusts in real time based on what the others are doing. It is like watching a flock of birds. Individual accuracy is low. Collective result is precise. I paused. The problem is that in a combat situation where they cannot rely on coordinated formation behavior, individual navigation falls apart. So they're good in tight formation and dangerous solo, Noel said. Correct. And the Auric know this. They disrupt Thuan formations before engaging. Noel drummed his fingers on the edge of the display. You know what they need? Gyroscopic correction at the individual drive level. Not replacing their navigation system, just adding a stabilization layer that reduces the variance on individual maneuvers. Each ship becomes a bit more accurate on its own, without losing the formation coordination. Can you design that? I said. Give me 2 days and full access to their drive housing specs, he said. I got him access. He took 1 day and 15 hours. The design was characteristically something that looked almost obvious once you saw it, which is the mark of a good engineering solution. A variable resistance gyroscopic mounting for the thrust vectoring assembly that passively stabilized directional output without requiring changes to the navigation software. It added mass. It slightly reduced peak thrust. In exchange, it cut navigational variance by approximately 60% in Noel simulations. And more importantly, it made each Thuan ship independently capable of a precision approach maneuver without requiring the collective to compensate in real time. When I showed the design to Propulsion Primary, the response took a moment to arrive, which I had learned meant the collective was processing it. Then, this changes the individual capability in a way we have not considered before. Yes, I said, we have always operated on the assumption that individual capability was secondary to collective capability. I understand that, I said. And in your natural operating environment, that is probably still true. But in a combat situation against an enemy that specifically targets your collective coordination, individual capability becomes your backup system. I leaned on the edge of the table. Right now, if someone disrupts your formation, you lose your precision. With this, you keep most of it. The collective makes you excellent. This makes you functional without it. The pause was longer this time. We will consider this. Take whatever time you need, I said. But not too long, because we are about to have more visitors. The Kellery arrived the day after the Thuan, and they arrived in a way that would have been alarming if I had not been expecting something unusual from every new arrival. The first indication we had that they were there was when a sensor operator on the Velshoreth reported a contact, and then lost it, and then found it again at a completely different position, and then lost it again. The Kellery ship was cloaked. It had been cloaked, Xale told me, since it entered the system, but it had dropped its cloak just long enough for the sensors to get a reading, and then gone invisible again. And this, Xale explained, was the Kellery way of knocking on a door. They want to know if we can see them, I said. They want to know if we are worth approaching, Xale said. Showing themselves briefly and disappearing is a test of our sensor capability. If we respond appropriately, they will judge us as perceptive enough to be worth their time. What is the appropriate response? Acknowledge that we saw them, Xale said. Precisely, without making a large display of it. They value quiet competence. I sent a navigation ping to the last known position, which was a politely neutral way of saying, yes, we saw you, and we know where you are, and we are not making a scene about it. 20 minutes later, a Kellery ship materialized 200 meters off the port side of the Velshoreth with absolutely no warning and apparently no transition, which was startling even knowing it was coming. The Kellery were smaller than I expected, compact and low, with a body plan that suggested they had evolved in dense environments where moving through small spaces efficiently mattered. They had excellent stillness, the ability to stay completely motionless for extended periods without any visible sign of discomfort, which made conversations with them feel like conversations with very patient statues who occasionally decided to answer a question. Their senior representative was called Aelith, and Aelith communicated in a way that I found refreshing. Every sentence was exactly as long as it needed to be, and no longer. Their weapon problem was specific and frustrating. Kellery stealth technology was extraordinary. Their ability to position a ship for an ideal strike was unmatched. But their weapons, energy-based projectors built around a focusing crystal array, overheated after 2 or 3 sustained firing cycles and required several minutes to cool before they could fire again. In a combat encounter where stealth could not be maintained indefinitely, those minutes were the difference between a decisive outcome and a catastrophic one. I looked at the overheating specs for an hour. Then I went to find Pete Hale. Pete was in the secondary cargo bay, where he and Lou had set up what had evolved into a full material testing station. He was currently running a stress test on a component from the Thuin gyroscopic mount prototype, monitoring the output on a portable display with a focused, unhurried attention he brought to everything. He had a quality I respected enormously. He did not perform thinking. He just did it. "Pete," I said, "tell me about heat management in a Formula One car." He looked up without surprise. He had stopped being surprised by my questions around A4. "What specifically?" "The braking system. How do you get rid of that much heat that fast without damaging the components?" He thought for a moment. "Carbon ceramic compound for the rotors, obviously. High surface area venting geometry. Managed airflow through the caliper housing." He paused. "But the real key is pathway design. You do not try to absorb the heat or eliminate it. You design a specific route for it to travel, away from the critical components and into a material or surface that can handle it. You control where the heat goes." "Pathway design," I said. "Yes." I looked at the Kellery weapon specs in my hand, then back at Pete. "I need you to look at something." We sat down together with the schematics. The Kellery focusing crystal array was elegant, and it was generating exactly the heat profile I would have predicted from the geometry. Concentrated in the central focusing zone, with no designed exit pathway, because the Kellery engineers had optimized for power output and precision and assumed that the thermal management was a secondary consideration. Pete studied the schematic with the same expression he probably used to study pit stop strategy. Calm, specific attention, looking for the one thing that unlocked the rest. "There," he said, after about 8 minutes. He pointed to the housing around the central crystal cluster. "That material is thermally resistant, which is why they chose it, to protect the crystal. But it is also trapping the heat in the worst possible location." He traced a path outward from the cluster with his finger. "If you redesign this housing to conduct heat outward along these vectors, away from the crystal center and into the outer shell structure, which can radiate it, you would clear the critical temperature threshold in maybe a third of the cool down time. Would it work for this material and this power level?" I said. "I would need to model it," Pete said. "But yes, the principle is sound. The heat wants to go somewhere. You just need to give it a better somewhere to go." I found Aelith and presented the concept. Aelith sat very still for a full 2 minutes, which I had learned was not unusual and did not indicate discomfort. Then Aelith said, "The solution uses knowledge developed for a ground vehicle competition?" "Yes," I said. Aelith looked at the schematic with the proposed pathway modifications. "And this is normal for your kind? To apply knowledge from one area to a completely different area?" "Very normal," I said. "It is actually one of the things we are best at." Aelith was quiet again for a moment. "We considered your species to be technologically primitive." "We are," I said, "compared to you. And yet," Aelith said, and then stopped, and then said, "Proceed with the modifications." The discovery about the auric came from a direction I had not expected. We found the spy on the 18th day of operations, which had by that point expanded to fill not just the Velshoreth, but 2 additional Veil support vessels and a workshop shuttle that Noel and I had adapted from mobile operations so that we could work on vessels too large to bring close to the main ship. The spy was a Kellery, which surprised almost everyone. It surprised me less when Ksale explained the situation. The auric had, over years of contact with concordant species, developed a sophisticated network of informants from within those species, not through ideology or loyalty, but through the very specific leverage of offering protection to individuals who cooperated. The spy was not a devoted enemy. The spy was someone who had been afraid. Ksale's instinct was to remove the individual from the operations area and manage the security breach. The standard protocol, it said, for this kind of situation. I asked to speak with the individual first. This produced a longer conversation than I expected because the concept of interviewing an informant before deciding what to do with them was apparently not standard Veil practice. But Xale had developed, over 3 weeks, a reasonable amount of faith in my judgment about things that were not strictly engineering, possibly because the engineering results had been good, possibly because I had never yet asked for something that turned out to be a bad idea. It agreed. The Kellery spy's name was Sev. Sev was young by Kellery standards and sat in front of me with the absolute stillness of its species, but with something underneath it that was clearly not calm. A fine, controlled tension that I recognized as the state of someone who is managing fear by deciding that stillness is safer than movement. I did not accuse Sev of anything. I asked Sev what the Auric wanted to know. Sev told me, after a pause, because there was no particular reason to lie at this point, and apparently some relief in being asked a direct question by someone who was not angry. The Auric wanted to know about the modifications. They wanted to understand what was being done and whether it was working. And they had told Sev something else, something that the Auric had let slip or chosen to share, perhaps to make the assignment seem more manageable. The reason the Auric were so invested in stopping this work was that their primary tactical advantage, their resonance disruptor, depended entirely on the crystalline lattice architecture being standard. If the architecture changed in unpredictable ways across multiple species, in ways the Auric had not modeled, their weapon systems would need to be recalibrated entirely. Recalibration, Sev said, repeating what had been told to them, would take a significant amount of time. The Auric were not infinitely patient, and they did not like unpredictability. They were afraid of things they could not model. I sat with that for a moment. Thank you, I said to Sev. I stood up. You're going to stay with us, not as a prisoner, but because it is safer for you here than out there right now. If you want something to do, I can find you useful work. I paused at the door. For what it is worth, I understand why you made the choices you made. Sev's stillness shifted slightly, not much, but enough for me to notice. You are not angry. I'm an engineer, I said. Angry is not a useful state. Understanding what happened and using it is useful. I opened the door. Also, you just told me something very important. I went directly to find the rest of the team. We had a meeting that night. All of US, Dan, Claire, Priya, Noel, Pete, Luke, Salveth, Propulsion Primary from the Thuan Collective, and Aelith, who sat in the corner so still that Luke glanced over twice to confirm they were still present. I told them what Sev had said. I told them what I had been thinking since. We have been approaching this as a repair and modification project, I said, and that is what it is. But the Aurica's fundamental tactical doctrine relies on predictability. It relies on knowing what our drives look like, what frequency they are vulnerable to, what architecture they share. Right now, we are making each ship harder to affect. But what if we made it harder to predict? I looked around the room. Each species has a different drive architecture. We have been modifying each architecture separately. What if we cross-modified, took elements of Veil, stress distribution, and applied them to Thuan drives? Applied Kellery thermal pathway design to Veil weapon systems. Mixed the approaches in ways that produced different signatures from every ship. Not random, but varied in ways that would require the Auric to recalibrate their targeting for every single vessel separately. Silence. Then Dan said, "You want to give every ship a different fingerprint." "I want every ship to be a slightly different problem," I said. "Not because different is automatically better. Because we know they cannot handle things they have not modeled." Priya was already pulling up a design framework on her display. Noel had a pen out and was sketching load distribution variations on a notepad. Pete and Lou had leaned into the center of the table with the focused attention of people who had just understood that this was the interesting part. XLS lights moved in a long, slow wave. "This," it said, "is a very human idea." "I know," I said. "Is that a problem?" "No," Xale said. "I'm beginning to think it is exactly what we need." The Auric fleet arrived on a Tuesday. Not that they knew it was Tuesday. Tuesdays are a human concept, and the Auric had no reason to organize time that way. But I was keeping Earth calendar in my notebook alongside the Veil chronological units because it helped me keep track of how long we had been at this. And when the proximity alarm lit up the navigation room of the Velshoreth, I wrote down the date and time in both systems before I moved. I am an engineer. Documentation matters. The fleet that appeared on the sensor display was 40 vessels. Xail confirmed the identification before the software did, its lights going very still in the way they did when Vale processed something that required careful attention. 40 ships was what Xail called a correction force. Not an invasion, not a full tactical engagement, but enough to make a point. The Auric had sent correction forces to Concordance worlds before. The correction forces had always made their point. I was standing at the center display, eating a protein bar because I had forgotten to eat breakfast, and it was now mid-afternoon, and Lou had put food in my hand and told me to eat it while I worked, which was the most practical thing anyone had said to me all day. Around me, the navigation room was controlled and focused. The Vale crew had been through this before, and they knew how to manage fear by giving it tasks. Colin Adler was with us. He had arrived 2 weeks earlier as the official ESA liaison, which was a diplomatic way of saying the people above me had decided that if I was going to keep making decisions that technically required higher authority, there should be someone present with that authority. Colin had adapted to the ship faster than I expected. He had also, quietly and without being asked, handled most of the communication with Earth's oversight bodies so that I did not have to, which freed up about 4 hours a day that I had previously spent on calls where I explained the same things repeatedly to people who asked good questions but could not move as fast as the situation required. 40 ships, Colin said from behind me. His voice was level. Colin's voice was always level. It was one of his genuine gifts. 40, I said. And our fleet is how many? Servantine combat capable, Vael Vaisselle. 3 Thuenhive ships. The 2 Kellery stealth units. I took a bite of the protein bar, plus whatever we are calling the Makuri Dreadnought. The Makuri had arrived 11 days earlier. That had been an experience. The Makuri were ancient, in the specific sense that their civilization had been operating at interstellar capability for longer than any other current Concordance member, and they carried this history in the way they held themselves, and the way they communicated, and the very design of their ship, which was a gravitational engineering masterpiece that managed mass and inertia in ways that the Vale engineers studied with open admiration. The Makuri themselves were large, heavily built, and communicated in a way that the translation system rendered as formal and precise and entirely without small talk. Their senior representative, Admiral Voren, had listened to my full briefing on the modification program and responded with a single question. What were our projected survival rates for the vessels we had modified? I gave Voren the numbers. Survival probability in a standard Auric engagement, pre-modification, roughly 30% for Vale-class vessels. Post-modification, based on Sail 6 field data and our simulations, somewhere between 70 and 80%, varying by engagement type. Voren had looked at these numbers for a long moment. Then, and for the crew of a Makuri Dreadnought in a comparable engagement, pre-modification, I looked at the Makuri specifications I had been given and ran the calculation carefully because I wanted to be precise. Then I told Voren. The number was low, lower than I expected given the raw capability of the ship, and when I thought about why, the answer was obvious. Makuri Dreadnoughts were extraordinarily powerful and not at all designed for the crew to escape if the ship itself became compromised. The escape system architecture was minimal. The Makuri, apparently, did not prioritize it. Your crew survival assumptions, I said carefully, are built on the premise that the crew will stay with the ship. Yes, said Voren. I would like to propose a modification, I said, that does not touch your drive systems, or your weapons, or your navigation, or any aspect of the ship's combat capability. I would like to propose a modification to your survival architecture. Voren's expression, which was difficult to read under the best of circumstances, became more difficult to read. You are proposing to add escape capability. I am proposing to add choice, I said. Right now your crew has no option. If the ship is lost, the crew is lost. What I am proposing is a system that gives your crew the ability to leave a compromised vessel and continue fighting from another platform. Survival as a tactical resource, not a retreat. Survival as a tactical resource, Voren repeated. Yes, a crew that survives can crew another ship. A crew that does not survive cannot. This conversation had lasted approximately 3 hours, and there were long silences in it, and I was not at all certain at the end of it which way Voren would decide. The next morning, Vorin sent a formal communication through Xail that said, in the precise formal language of Makuri communication, the modification is approved. Proceed. Noel had spent 4 days on the escape system design, with Pete and Lou doing the fabrication and installation with a Makuri engineering crew, who were technically exceptional and culturally uncomfortable with the project, but committed to it with full professional seriousness once Vorin had approved it. The result was elegant in the way Noel's work always was. A distributed pod system that integrated with the existing hull structure without visibly altering the Dreadnought's profile, with a rapid deployment mechanism that Pete had adapted from emergency aircraft evacuation principles. Now, looking at 40 Oryx ships on the sensor display, I was glad we had gotten it done. I finished the protein bar and handed the wrapper to Lou, who disposed of it without comment. "All right," I said. "Let us go over the engagement plan one more time." The engagement plan was mine, built over the previous week with input from Xail, Propulsion Primary, Aelith, and Vorin. The core of it was deceptively simple. Do not fight the Auric the way the Auric expected to be fought. The Auric Correction Force Doctrine relied on a specific sequence. They arrived. They activated the Resonance Disruptor Array. The Concordance ships, whose crystalline lattice drives were vulnerable to the resonance frequency, began to lose propulsion and maneuvering capability. The Auric then had a stationary or minimally mobile target set and could dictate the terms of everything that followed. It was efficient and it had worked reliably for years. The first problem with that doctrine, as I had designed it, was that the resonance disruptor was now considerably less effective than it had been. The modified drives did not give the resonance frequency the clean crystalline target it needed. Some ships would feel the effect. None of them would be disabled by it. The second problem was that the Auric targeting systems were designed to classify and prioritize targets by drive signature. They were very good at this. Every Concordance ship they had ever encountered had a recognizable drive signature, and the Auric had built extensive tactical databases around those signatures, knowing exactly what each one meant in terms of a ship's capability, its likely behavior, its vulnerability profile. What they were about to encounter were ships with drive signatures that did not match those databases. Some would be close to the recorded signatures. Some would be significantly different. A few would produce signatures the Auric recognition software would classify as errors or unknown. The Auric tactical system would spend the opening minutes of the engagement attempting to reconcile what it was seeing with what it had modeled, and in those minutes, it would not be choosing optimal targets. It would be asking questions. The third problem was the Kellery. The Kellery ships were not on the Auric sensors. They had not been on our sensors either until Aelith had decided to appear. They were currently positioned at coordinates that I was confident the Auric did not know about, in precisely the locations that our modeling suggested would be most useful in the 4th minute of the engagement, which was when we expected the Auric targeting systems to finish their initial confusion cycle and begin selecting primary targets. The Kellery would not be there when that decision was made. They would be elsewhere, and then they would fire, and then they would move again. "Contact in 3 minutes," said the navigation officer. Colin came to stand next to me. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "you did extraordinary work." "We did not finish the work," I said. "We tested a phase of it. There is a difference." "Yara," he said, with the patient tone of someone who has given up correcting me on certain things, except the sentence. "After we know how it goes," I said. The Auric fleet came out of their drive transition at standard correction force deployment spread, wide and organized and confident in the specific way that things are confident when they have worked exactly the same way many times. I could see the emission pattern of the resonance disruptor array activating almost immediately, a cascade of readings across our sensor board that meant they were already doing the thing that had stopped every fleet they had ever encountered. Nothing in our fleet stopped. I watched the navigation display. The Veil ships held their positions, and their drive readings stayed nominal. The Thuan Hive ships, in their close formation, turned with the quiet, precise coordination that Noel's gyroscopic stabilizers had enhanced without changing, a formation movement that tracked to the Auric left flank. The Makuri dreadnought did not move at all, which was exactly what it was supposed to do, because a dreadnought sitting still in the center of a battle space is an enormous problem that demands immediate attention, and the Auric would give it that attention, And while they were giving it that attention, they would not be giving attention to other things. On the tactical display, I could see the auric response pattern. There was a hesitation in it that I recognized from simulations. The targeting delay, the moment when the classification system tried to make sense of the signatures it was reading and could not immediately do so. On a standard concordance fleet, that moment would not exist. There was no question about what a veil drive signature meant. Now, there were questions, and the questions were costing the auric exactly the seconds we needed. The Thuan hive ships hit the left flank in the 3rd minute. They hit it precisely, which was new for Thuan ships, and the auric vessels on the left were not optimally positioned to respond because the auric tactical model had classified the Thuan formation as lower precision than it was, which was information from old data. In the 4th minute, the Kellery appeared. They appeared at 2 points simultaneously, which I knew was one ship moving very fast between 2 positions and firing from each. But the effect on the auric tactical display was 2 contacts suddenly existing where there had been none, firing on targets that the auric had considered safe, and then vanishing again. The auric command response to this was visible in the sensor data as a reassignment of targeting priority that made strategic sense on the basis of old information and made much less sense given the current situation. In the 6th minute, the Makuri dreadnought fired once at the auric command vessel, at a range that the auric had apparently not classified as engagement range for a dreadnought of that type, because the Makuri had modified their gravitational drive in a way that Priya and I had worked out in the 2nd week that extended effective range by a factor the auric databases did not have. The auric command vessel was not destroyed. It was very significantly damaged. I watched the display. I was doing mental calculations, tracking the engagement against the projections from our planning sessions, noting where outcomes were matching the model and where they were diverging, making mental notes for the analysis we would need to do afterward. The protein bar was gone. Lou appeared at my elbow with something else to eat, recognized from my expression that now was not the moment, and withdrew quietly. In the 9th minute, the auric fleet began to regroup. Not retreat yet. Reorganize. Pull back the damaged vessels. Restructure the formation. Reassess. I could read the tactical intention in the movement pattern. They were resetting to try a second approach with updated information. I looked at Sail. If they reset and try again with everything they have learned in the last 9 minutes, what is our outcome? XALS lights moved through a calculation that I had learned to read as the pattern of precise assessment. Less favorable than the first 9 minutes, it said, but not the same as before we made the modifications. Different, more even. Then we do not give them the reset, I said. I looked at the tactical officer. Push the engagement. Now, while they are mid-reorganization, do not let them settle. Xel looked at me for a moment. Then to the tactical officer, in Vale, giving the command. The Vale ships moved forward. The Thuan hive ships, reading the fleet movement with their collective awareness, matched the advance. The Makuri dreadnought moved for the first time since the engagement began, slowly, deliberately, an object of such mass that its movement toward the auric reorganization was itself a statement. The Kellery appeared again, in a different location from either of their previous 2 appearances, and fired. The auric correction force retreated. It did not retreat fully, and it did not retreat in disorder. It pulled back to a distance that was outside our effective engagement range, and it held there, and there was a period of approximately 4 minutes where nothing happened and both sides sat in their positions, and the sensor displays showed only distances and drive emissions, and nothing moving in either direction. They are deciding, Sales said, quietly, from beside me. What are their options? I said, continue with a larger commitment than a correction force, or withdraw to assess what has happened and prepare a different response. Which will they choose? XALS lights move slowly. I do not know. No auric correction force has ever needed to make this choice before. We watched the display. The 4 minutes stretched. On the sensor board, the auric fleet held its position, and I found myself thinking not about the tactical situation, but about Sev's words. They were afraid of things they could not model. They were sitting out there right now, in 40 ships, looking at sensor data that did not match their databases and trying to understand how a fleet of concordance vessels, A civilization they had been systematically disabling for 3 years had just fought them to a position where continuing the engagement carried real cost. The resonance disruptors had not worked. The drive signatures had not matched their classifications. The Kellery had appeared in locations they had not predicted. The Makuri dreadnought had fired from a range outside what their data said was possible. They were encountering for the first time a version of the thing I'd been building for 6 weeks, a fleet that did not behave the way their models said it should. The Auric fleet moved away from us, steady, controlled, deliberate, the movement of a force that was not fleeing but choosing. They transitioned to faster-than-light travel in sequence, and the sensor display emptied out over the course of about 2 minutes, and then there was nothing there. The navigation room was very quiet. Then Propulsion Primary's collective voice came through the communication channel from the Thuan ships, and the translation produced something that was clearly a statement of surprise, stated 4 times by 4 slightly different collective voices, because the Thuan sometimes responded in parallel when something was significant enough that multiple nodes expressed it simultaneously. Voron's voice came next, from the Makuri dreadnought, in the formal, precise Makuri communication style. They left. Yes, I said. They have not left before, Voron said. No, I said. They have not. XALS lights were doing something I had only seen once before, on the day Sail 6 came back from the supply run that should have ended badly. A long, expanding wave from center to edge, warm and bright, that moved through every pattern it had and came to rest in something simple and still. Colin put his hand on my shoulder briefly, which was more of an emotional display than I had ever seen from him in 11 years. Lou put food in my hand again. This time I ate it. I did not feel like celebrating. I felt the way I feel at the end of a successful test, satisfied specifically and precisely, and already thinking about what needed to happen next. The Auric would reassess. They would update their models. They would come back, not with a correction force, but with something larger and with new information and a strategy adapted to what they had just learned. The advantage we had was temporary. The knowledge gap we had created would narrow. I went back to the display and started writing notes. Xale found me there, as it often did, in the period after the room had cleared out and it was quiet. Its lights were still content in the specific way I had learned to read as the state after something significant. You are working, it said. I am working, I said. We just did something that has not been done before. Xale said. In Living Veil memory, no Auric correction force has been turned back. I know, I said. And you're making notes. Because we have not turned back the next one yet, I said. And the next one will know what the last one did not. I looked up. We bought time. Time is useful. I plan to use it. XALS lights moved. The small, warm fire. I am, it said, very glad we came to your planet. So am I said, and I meant it completely. And then I went back to my notes because meaning something completely and having work to do are not in conflict and never have been. The fleet left on a morning that felt like every other morning aboard the Velshoreth, which meant it was busy and slightly too warm, and someone in the corridor was already having a technical discussion in a language my translation earpiece was only partially keeping up with. I stood on the upper observation gantry of ESA Nairobi, the one that looks out over the launch pads, and watched them prepare to go. 14 months had passed since Xale had walked out a ship that was not supposed to be there and asked for whoever was responsible for building things. 14 months of work that I did not entirely know how to describe because it had started as a repair job and become something else, something I did not have a clean word for, and I had stopped trying to find one. The fleet below was not the fleet that had arrived. That fleet had been battered Veil vessels and a desperate plan. This fleet was 53 ships, and not one of them was the same as it had been. They carried modified drives and composite lattice hulls and gyroscopic stabilizers and heat pathway weapon systems and escape pod networks and 100 smaller adjustments built by 112 human engineers over 14 months of work that had been exhausting and difficult and the most interesting thing I had ever done in my life. The ships looked different too, not dramatically, not in ways a casual observer would notice, but in ways I noticed because I knew every modification on every hull and could see from here the small evidence of each one. the slightly altered exhaust profile of a Vale mid-class vessel whose drive timing had been retuned 3 times. The reinforced strut geometry on a Thuan hive ship's forward section where Noel had identified a stress concentration in week 7. The barely visible seam lines. On the Makuri dreadnought where the escape pods were housed, flush with the hull. Invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. Sail came to stand beside me. It had developed over 14 months, a way of arriving that I had stopped noticing as arrival. It was simply there, and then we were talking, and that was comfortable. How long to Oryx space? I said, at the drive capability we now have. Sail said, roughly 40 of your days. Less if the Thuan maintain their new formation discipline, and we can sustain the coordinated jump sequence we tested last week. They will maintain it, I said. The Thuan collective had taken to the gyroscopic stabilizers with the thoroughness of a species that had identified an improvement to something important and committed to mastering it. Propulsion Primary had sent me a data report 3 days earlier documenting the variance reduction across the entire Thuan formation, which was now down to 11% of its pre-modification level. I had kept the report in my notebook. Below, the loading operations continued. The final supply runs, the last technical checks, the small, organized activity of people who were ready to leave and were completing the last things before they did. I could see Pete and Lou near one of the Vale mid-class vessels, talking to a Vale technician in the efficient shorthand they had developed over months of working together. The gestures and quick references of people who had solved enough shared problems to build a working language without needing a translation device for most of it. Pete was pointing at something on the underside of the hull. The Vale technician was nodding, which was a gesture the Vale had apparently adopted from working with humans rather than using their natural light communication for small affirmations, because nodding was faster in a working context. Aelith is already aboard, Sail said. The Kellery do not say formal goodbyes. It is considered to draw attention to a departure. I know, I said. I left a note in their secondary cargo bay. A paper note. Yes. I paused. Aelith sent back a light pattern response through one of the Vale crew. Sail, what does the pattern mean? Sail's lights moved briefly. It is a Kellery phrase. The closest translation would be, quiet acknowledgement of a debt that will not be spoken of, and therefore carries more weight. I thought about that. That is a lot for a note. Aelith liked the note, Sail said. Vorin had said goodbye yesterday, formally and precisely, and in the way Vorin did everything, with complete attention, without excess. The Makuri senior engineer had spent 2 hours the day before walking through the escape pod system with me one more time, not because there was anything to correct, but because the engineer wanted to understand every decision that had been made in the design. I had gone through each one. At the end, the engineer had asked me a question that I had been thinking about since. Did you know, when you proposed a change to Admiral Vorin, that Vorin would agree? No, I said. What made you propose it anyway? Because it was the right answer to the problem, I said. Whether or not it was going to be accepted did not change whether it was the right answer. You propose the right answer, and then you see what happens. The engineer had been quiet for a moment. We have a saying in Makuri, they had told me. The closest translation is, the correct path is correct whether or not it is taken. A pause. We had not previously considered that this also applies to technical proposals. I had written that down when I got back to my notebook. Now I looked at the fleet and thought about the conversation I had had with Arthur Finley the previous week in his office on the other side of the facility with coffee that was finally normal coffee at a normal temperature, which I had appreciated more than I expected. Arthur had asked me, carefully and with the tact of someone who chooses words with purpose, whether I thought this was going to work. Not the fleet, the approach. The idea that the Auric, confronted with a coalition that they could not disable by their standard method and could not predict by their standard modeling, would choose negotiation over escalation. I had told Arthur what I genuinely believed. The Auric were not irrational. They had built a system of expansion on the specific assumption that the civilizations they encountered would respond in predictable ways to a well-established playbook. The correction force retreat had been the first real evidence that the playbook was not working. A civilization that bases its success on predictable opponents will eventually encounter the problem of what to do when an opponent is not predictable. And the rational response to that problem is to find a different approach, not to double the investment in an approach that has stopped working. This was not guaranteed, but it was the most likely response from a civilization that was fundamentally practical. You are thinking, Sale said from beside me. I'm always thinking, I said. You are thinking more than usual. I looked down at the gantry railing under my hands. My wrench was in my jacket pocket, which was where it usually was. I had carried a wrench in a pocket for so long that the absence of the slight weight of it felt wrong. I am thinking about what comes after, I said. What comes after the negotiation? What comes after all of it? After the Oryx situation is resolved, one way or another. After the fleet comes home. I paused. The other species in the Concordance now have ships that work differently than they did. That is good. But they also need to understand why the changes work so that they can continue developing in that direction rather than just having better hardware that they maintain without improving. The knowledge needs to transfer, not just the technology. Excel was quiet for a moment. You're going to want to teach them. I'm going to need to teach a lot of people a lot of things, I said. Not the specific techniques. The approach. The habit of looking at a problem and trying something and then trying something else when the first thing does not work. The willingness to accept imperfection in a solution if the imperfection is functional. I looked at the fleet below. Xale, when you first came here, you described humans as having inelegant persistence. Do you remember? Yes, Xale said. The Veil now designs ships to be fixable, I said. Not just to be perfect. You told me that last week. Yes, Xale said. It is a significant change. It required several extended conversations at senior engineering levels. There was disagreement. Of course there was disagreement, I said. But it happened. It happened, Xale agreed. I watched the loading continue below. Dan was coming across the pad with Claire, both of them in conversation, gesturing at a display Dan was carrying. They were probably discussing the second-generation drive prototype, which was currently in its fourth iteration and which Dan had some specific ideas about that I agreed with in principle and disagreed with in one particular detail, a disagreement we had been productively maintaining for 3 weeks and which I expected to resolve itself during the testing phase, when one of us turned out to be correct. I was looking forward to finding out which one. Xale asked me, then, the question I had been half expecting. Will you come with us? I had known this was coming. I had been thinking about my answer for 2 weeks, which was longer than I usually needed to think about an answer and considerably shorter than the question deserved. No, I said. XLS lights moved through something complex and slow. The offer is genuine. I know it is, I said, and I am genuinely honored by it. You know that. Then why? I looked at the facility around us, the buildings I had worked in for 11 years. The launch pads I knew by the sound they made at different times of day. The maintenance hangar where I had been on my back under engine bay 7 when the ground shook. Because the most useful thing I can do from here is not go with you, I said. You have everything we can give you in hardware terms for now. What you do not have yet is the transfer of the underlying thinking. And that is going to require more time and more people and a different kind of effort than I can do from a ship that is traveling to Oryx space. I turned to look at Xale directly. 3 more species sent envoys while we were preparing the fleet for departure. I have a meeting tomorrow. Caselis lights shifted. You will not rest. I will rest when the list is shorter, I said. The list is not shorter. Xale reached into the satchel it carried, which it did not often do in my presence, and produced a small object that it held out toward me. It was a fragment of crystalline lattice material, one of the original Veil components about the size of my palm, that had been cut and shaped and polished in a way that made it catch the light and scatter it in the gentle, slightly too many directions way that had first struck me when the ship landed. On its surface, in a pattern that I recognized as deliberate and careful, were a series of Veil-like glyphs that I could not read. What does it say? I said. XLS lights moved in a long, warm wave. It says, the one who fixed things when they were broken. I looked at the fragment in my hand. It was warm, which I had not expected, and the light that moved through it shifted slightly as I tilted it, as if it were still alive in some way that non-functional material should not be. I closed my hand around it carefully. Thank you, I said. Below, the final loading was complete. I could see the crew movement on the pads, changing from active work to preparation for departure. The last clear outs, the perimeter established, the organized withdrawal that meant engines would be firing soon. Xale needed to go. The notebook, Xale said. The one you gave me. Yes. I have read it many times. It is not very exciting reading, I said. It is mostly load calculations and material specifications and a few diagrams. It is, Xale said, the clearest explanation I have encountered of how you think. Not what you think. How? Its lights moved. I have shared copies with the engineering leads of every species in this fleet. Not because the specific content is directly applicable to all of them. Because the method is. I thought about that. 53 ships worth of engineering leads, reading a paper notebook full of load calculations and diagrams that I had written for one person. It was a strange image and also, somehow, exactly right. Take care of the fleet, I said. Take care of the new arrivals, Xale said. It turned and went down the gantry steps, moving with the quiet economy that I had long since stopped noticing as alien and just experienced as Xale. I watched it cross the pad and enter the Velshorth's access ramp, and the ramp closed in the way things on that ship always closed, with a deliberate, unhurried certainty. I stayed on the gantry. The fleet launched in sequence, not with the drama I had expected the first time I thought about it, not with enormous fire and noise, but with the particular sound of things that had been made to move correctly and were now moving correctly, a series of drive signatures I recognized individually because I had worked on each one, rising and lifting and assembling in the sky above the facility in a formation that tightened as it climbed. Vale and Thuin and Kellery and Makuri together and distinct and changed. I watched until they were gone. Then I stood there for a moment in the quiet, with the fragment of lattice worm in my hand and the wrench in my pocket and the list in my notebook and the morning sounds of the facility coming back around me as it returned to the business of being a place where people built and maintained and improved the things that let other things move. I turned around and walked back down the gantry steps. In my office, on the corner of the desk, was a new file. A briefing document on 3 species who had sent envoys while we were preparing the fleet. A concordance member called the Cerati, whose propulsion technology was based on entirely different principles than anything we had worked on yet. A civilization called the Helluan, who had a specific and unsolved problem with heat management at the atmospheric entry stage of their transport vessels. And a third species whose name the translation system rendered with a note that the phonetic equivalent was approximate and might be refined with more data, who had sent a single message that said, in the translation, "We heard you fix things. We have things that need fixing." I sat down and opened the file. Outside my window, the sky was the particular blue that Nairobi mornings have after clear nights, and the facility was waking up around me, and there was fresh coffee in the machine by the door, and I had work to do. I picked up my pen and started with the Cerati.